but is there an existential response within myself that I can muster up and say, okay, im kol zeh ani mamin. Whether it means ani mamin that I believe, or sometimes ani mamin means ani ne'eman. I am still loyal. I still live as a loyal Jew, even if that particular concept I have difficulty with.
Welcome to Extra Sauce. My name is Chaim Cohn, and that was the sweet sounds of Mordechai Hirschman singing My Kamash Malan, personal favorite of mine, and the perfect song for this episode, two-part episode, and a good example of why I so love this medium. Last week, Motzei Shabbos, I was at a birthday party of a friend, and someone who I knew, but never quite personally, just knew of him, was there, and that's my guest, Yehudah DovBer Zirkind, and we chatted a bit, and it was late at night, but I live across the street, and I asked him to come by, and we have a lot of mutual interests, and we played some Yiddish records and chazanis that he's into, and we got to talking, and then I took the recorder out, and he was very spontaneous and jumped in, and I want to thank him for doing that, because as you'll hear, the conversation that followed is really rich and unique. We ended up speaking together from 1 to 4 in the morning, and the conversation was so rich and flowed so well that I'm posting it in its entirety. I didn't edit this. I just tried to clean up the sound just a bit because it was recorded on my phone at home. So who is Yehudah DovBer Zirkind? Yehudah grew up in Crown Heights. He was educated in the Chabad Yeshiva system. He made Aliya to Israel in 2006. He's currently a senior research fellow at the David Cardozo Academy in Jerusalem. He's also a researcher, writer, and lecturer on a wide range of topics in the field of Jewish academia. Yehudah is currently a graduate student of Yiddish literature at Tel Aviv University, and the topic of his forthcoming thesis is entitled The Sacred, the Secular, and the Sacrilegious in the Life and Literary Works of Chaim Grada. His research interests include contemporary Jewish thought, Yiddish and Hebrew literature, neo-Chassidism, Yiddish music and folklore, and Jewish bibliography. I will post a link in the description of the podcast to some of Yehudah's work, and a lot of interesting stuff there, ranging from Jewish philosophy, Chassidic history, and a wealth of research that he's done on Chassidic music and folklore and other great things. In our conversation, we discuss a variety of issues, namely Yehudah's own journey and reflections on growing up in the Frum community and specifically the Lubavitch community. It's important to note that this conversation was completely off the cuff, so none of the opinions or ideas stated are, a last word or any kind of fixed opinion, just reflections and conversation oriented. I will post Yehudah DovBer's information, contact information in the description, and he welcomes anyone's feedback and is looking to start and continue a conversation about the stuff we discussed. Also, good to note that this was recorded in my house, so the audio quality is as best I can get it. What else? I'll post the links to the music that I use in the description as always, and my email address is there as well. If you like this, or if you like the other ones, or if you like all of them, or if you just like me, you can give the podcast a nice review on either Apple Podcasts or Google, or wherever you do your thing. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll bounce back on for part 2.
My name is Yehudah DovBer Zirkind. I grew up here in Crown Heights. I was born in 1979, the end of 1979, so I'm almost 40 years old. And I grew up in the Lubavitch system. Grew up very close to 770 all my life, early life, that is. And my mother's side is very strong Lubavitch family, very neo-Chassidism Lubavitch family, called Geja, which has all kinds of connotations, both positive and negative.
Which family is
the
that?
The Groner family.
Right.
Where we're descendants also of the Alter Rebbe and the Littler Rebbe, and so forth. But a lot of people know me as a Zirkin, and when you mention the name Zirkin, it invokes all kinds of associations. My grandfather was known as a very unique individual. Within Lubavitch, he was not mainstream. He was different. He was unique in his own way. He thought for himself. He did his own thing. Although he was a very devoted chassid of the Rebbe in his own way. He
lived here in Crown Heights?
Yeah. Although not all of his life. I was born in Manhattan, Beth Israel, Mount Sinai actually. But I grew up in Crown Heights. And he actually was born, as a kid, I think he lived in Williamsburg, or his young life, his formative years were in Williamsburg. And as far as I understand, his grandfather were Lubavitch back from White Russia, from Babroisk. But when my great-grandfather actually came to America, maybe the Zirkin family won't feel comfortable with what I'm saying now or their version of my version of events. But as far as I understand, they were observant. It was very clear that my elder Zayda was a butcher and he kept Shabbos, and that was part of it, that being a butcher allowed him to run his own business, and he didn't have to be Machal Shabbos, which was a huge thing. And he also considered himself Lubavitch, but he was clean-shaven. And I don't know how Chassidish or how Charegish his house was. I don't know. I don't know one way or the other. I mean, I'm very wary of people who try to paint history backwards, saying that if there's a certain standard today, it must mean that this was a standard that was kept years ago. Especially in Haredi circles, or in all circles, there's history revision of history, historical revisionism, because we take a certain standard which is accepted today and we project it backwards, saying that because this is the way things were, it was always that way. It wasn't necessarily true. But anyway, for me, I mean, I really don't want to talk about my family because that is more personal in terms of my family. They have their own image that they want to protect. And I feel more comfortable and more empowered and more of a balabas, more of a right to talk about myself, whether people like it or not. But in terms of background, I would just say this, that my grandfather was known as a very, very staunchly devout, ultra-Orthodox Jew. He fought for his Yiddishkeit. He was ready to sacrifice himself for his Yiddishkeit when he was drafted into the American Army in the early 1950s, and he fought in the Korean War. He fought to keep his beard and payas, and I actually saw documents. He fought to keep kashrus and Shabbos and all those things. So that was a guiding force throughout my life growing up, that my Zayder, Rabbi Zirkind, was a very, very staunchly devout Jew, and he fought for his Yiddishkeit and very, very strong values. And I grew up in a much more intensively religious environment, I would say, than even most Lubavitcher households, where maybe they focused more on Chassidishkeit, and we were much more frum, like the good old-fashioned Shulchan Aruch Yiddishkeit type Judaism. And it also had an effect on me. That kind of strict, regimented type of upbringing was definitely a very, very all-encompassing, all-immersive experience for me growing up as a kid. And I went on my own journey, still on my own journey, in all kinds of different ways. The journey contains many components: psychological, emotional, intellectual, existential. Some of it has to do with life, some of it has to do with Judaism, some of it has to do with understanding my relationship to other people in the world and meaning in life in general, and also understanding, trying to make sense of who I am as a person, as a human being, as a Jew, as my relationship with Lubavitch, with religion, with Judaism and all that. So I'm a searcher in that sense of the word. And I'm ready, or I don't know if I'm ready, or it was kind of forced on me to question who I am and not just take things for granted, not just to buy into the party line. In other words, not accepting what I was taught by my rebbes or my rebbes and mashpim and yeshiva as to who I am, what I'm supposed to do. I found that was not satisfying to me, that I had to do my own search.
At what point did you give yourself permission to do that, or were you always?
I would say, actually, quite ironically, that it was growing up in the Zirkind house, which gave me a certain autonomy of thought and a certain empowerment of thought, which is lacking in many, many other homes. Because, first of all, there was a very, very strong focus on textual study. There was always a focus on knowing stuff and learning stuff directly from the source, from the Sefer, from the Shulchan Aruch, from the Gemara, from Tanakh. It was less a matter of, this is what I told you. There was always that ability to go to the Sefer, I'm going to show you what it says in the Sefer. There was always an accountability to the primary sources. So that also enabled me to say that when I learned the art or the ability, when I learned how to master primary text, so then I am also empowered to discuss them and see what they say for myself, and not just take my Rebbe's interpretation or my rabbi's interpretation of the text as a God-given word. That began one streak of my journey. I guess from a very, very young age, I was precocious and also was an autodidact in my own way. I used to study a lot on my own. I used to read books on my own. I would always find the odd books, off the beaten path, as it were, the non-mainstream books on the shelf. I always found them intriguing. Like if if the staple of what I was being taught to learn was the Tanakh and the Gemara and Halacha, I would gravitate to the book HaMachshava or Jewish history, or grammar or Kabbalah, things that weren't the mainstream. And kind of looking at Judaism through another lens or a more expanded view of it also allowed me to see that what I was being taught was one particular version of Judaism, and that the Jewish tradition is a lot greater than what is being taught as the official authorized version of what Judaism is all about.
And so intellectually you were always, empowered and allowed yourself to go off the beaten path, and did at some point that veer more towards how you saw yourself religious-wise, or the way you come across, or like your belief system? Did one impact the other at some point?
Oh, definitely. I mean, first of all, I just want to state that my intellectual journey was never undertaken in isolation or in a vacuum. There were definitely other factors that were perhaps even more pressing and more urgent for me, especially in the beginning of my journey. Nascent sexuality, which is a very, very big issue, which is underaddressed in the frum world.
Yeah.
What to do with sexual desire, and especially when I was in yeshiva, I didn't even tell you anything about it, how to deal with it. So relationships, urges, understanding desire in the context of desire and prohibition, like the conflict between sexual desire and the prohibition against actually actualizing those desires and knowing what to do with them. So that is a very strong element that cannot be overlooked. There was also family relationships at home. For example, my style of thinking and approaching the world was very different than my father's style and thinking. Not necessarily what worked for him or for his generation worked for me. And there's always that element of wanting to individuate, the element of teenage rebellion or figuring out who you are. Many times figuring out who you are is by contrast or by in opposition to your parents. That has to be taken into consideration. So there were many, many factors. Also, existentially, going through life and asking questions about the meaning of life also had an impact. So all these things kind of propelled me on my journey. And in a certain way, when I came across the books of Chaim, like The Chosen and The Promise, and my name is Asher Lev, and in the beginning, I realized that I'm like a character, and almost like I could be the main protagonist, the leading protagonist in almost all of his titles, right? One way or the other. I can be a Danny Saunders from The Chosen, or a Ruby Malter from The Promise, or a David Lurie from In the Beginning, or an Asher Lev, for my name is Asher Lev, and the gift of Asher Lev. And these are very, very different struggles. One is about psychology, one is about art and aesthetics, one is about scholarship, critical scholarship in Jewish text. And all of these aspects are conflicts that I experienced in my own upbringing. And so there were really numerous things that were combined forces, which made me, I guess, question or made me feel discontent with the Lubavitch derech that I was living up until a certain point in my life, and which I actually was very, very committed to, and I was actually very, very deeply involved and immersed in, until for many, many years in a very, very strong way.
If you had to guess, I'm just thinking about my own social circle, people I grew up with in Yeshiva, and people I know now. And there's a very significant number of people I know who are, deep thinkers, deal with the existential questions, knowledgeable, curious, and deal with all the other things you mentioned, awareness, and the family aspect, the emotional and the sexual and all that, and yet are also very committed to an observant life, and they kind of, are kind of, I wouldn't say cursed, but almost burdened with needing to, live with both of those at the same time. And it's if they wouldn't have grown up in it, I see these individuals as being, real, trailblazing individuals that would, allow themselves to kind of really push the limits, because it's almost coming out of them, and yet it's contained strongly. And sometimes I lament that, and sometimes I guess I see it as a beautiful thing, how someone can kind of live in that paradox. But I'm wondering how many people, not just within the Lubavitch community, are really, have expansive minds and thoughts, and yet are living within the confines of religious life. And how does that happen? How does it maintain?
Well, you're actually touching on a very, very important point, and one that is not simple or unidimensional at all. This is a very multidimensional issue. And I do know quite a number of people growing up, both from within the community in Lubavitch and also beyond it, who are struggling, or I use the word struggle a lot, who struggle with conflict in all kinds of different ways. And I don't think there is one answer that can describe everyone, because we have not prepared this at all, and no questions, nothing. This is on the fly. I'll just maybe make a few on-the-spot observations. First of all, I think that a lot of it depends on how strong the push and pull of the conflict is. For example, if somebody is very, very attached to Judaism, and their other interests are more peripheral or not as strong, so the conflict won't be as great. And then there are other people for whom Judaism is so deeply embedded into who they are, that there's no way that they can abandon it, even if they're very, very deeply conflicted. I mean, we mentioned before the Yasher Levs. Today they're the classic issue, let's say, women who feel isolated or limited in their roles in traditional Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, Lubavitch, or any Orthodox Judaism. And especially today with issues of homosexuality and transgender and all those people that don't conform to the binary categories that the religious community usually puts them in. That is a big issue. So there are certain people for whom the community it just doesn't work for them. I use the analogy of a conveyor belt, that I feel a lot of people in the system, in the community, are being processed on a conveyor belt. And for the most part, they fit the cookie cutter model. And that's what the system tries to do them. They try to make them fit into a certain mold. Now, it could be there is a bit of adjustments and there are different flavors. Not there's only one flavor. There is a variety. There is a range. I'm not going to say, especially in Lubavitch, are a lot more open than other Haredi communities, and perhaps Satmar or Skver or Bells. But yet there is still an expectation that you will conform within certain varieties of the mold, the model. When a person feels that the production line, the conveyor belt, doesn't work for them, that the factory or that their education is not, they feel a clash between what the educational system, the way the educational system is trying to mold them, and what they feel their innate nature is, and that is a recipe for an explosion or implosion or going off track. There are people that come to a point where the conflict is so acute that they just need to opt out completely from the system. It could be due to an acute emotional experience. It can be sexual trauma. It can be emotional trauma. It can be feeling trapped, deeply trapped within a community. I feel a lot of Hasidic people who go off the derech are young men and young women who are forced into a lifestyle which they see as one which is going to enslave them for the rest of their lives, and working extremely hard and not having any freedom, raising kids nonstop, and living a life of Judaism which they come to hate and not appreciate. So there's a lot of the emotional baggage. And then there are other people that are, I would think the more artistic, intellectual types for whom perhaps they don't, the initial conflict is not one where they feel so emotionally traumatized by the clash between religion and their basic needs being unfelt, or lack of security, or lack of basic well-being. But it's more an issue of expanding their horizons. And take a female singer, for example, who has an issue with Kol Isha. Take the Asher Lev, who, as an artist, is trying to find his way in the aesthetic realm, and because Judaism doesn't have a developed tradition of visual art like non-Jews have, are compelled to find their aesthetic expression elsewhere, and then it brings them into conflict, painting nudes or crucifixions. So, or people who their intellectual horizons have taken them beyond the confines of what is considered acceptable within the normative religious world. Then there are all kinds of different ways of dealing with it. Now, some people will say, I need to leave the community completely, and there's no way I can find myself in it. Other people will say that I can I'll try to fit in the community as much as possible, with the exception of those few things that I just need to make my own adjustment for. So you can have somebody who'll say, I will be religious, but I will paint freely and disregard halacha or what is acceptable. So there are all kinds of different ways, and I don't think there's one size fits all at all in that regard.
So, bring it back to you. Was there a particular point at which you overcame the emotional restrictions or familial restrictions that you had and allowed yourself to kind of venture out on your own? When was that, and was there something particular that was the impetus for that?
Well, in my own journey, I must say that I started questioning deeply when I was about 2021. There may have been seeds of discontent that began to sprout earlier. But it was only really when I started studying for smicha, when I felt that I just felt a certain unease with a lot of things that were going on, or with the future that was being dictated to me by the powers that be. This is the way I'm supposed to live my life. It was very clear who I was supposed to be. I was supposed to be a Rav. I was supposed to be a Chassidic Bocher. I was supposed to be a strictly observant, if not even more than your average frum guy. So there were certain expectations and instructions. Expectations, perhaps unwritten, but nevertheless clearly explicit. This is the way we expect you to turn out. And I was feeling even...
You're also the oldest boy.
Yeah, I'm the oldest in my family. I also realized that for me, for example, I would have gone into more details in terms of the Chassidic, the Tanya, and what can present as a conflict for a Lubavitcher, is the fact that in Tanya, Dr. Rebbe describes a very, very strict dichotomy between the Nefesh Elikis, the godly soul, and the Nefesh Bahamis, the animal soul. And that is quite different than what most Frum Jews who don't learn Tanya, the way they see the world. Mm-hmm. What I mean by that is that within normative Orthodox Judaism, if we don't go to the Tanya, there are basically three categories. There are things that are required, there's chiyuv. There are things that are prohibited, there's aser. And then there is the permissible, but not obligatory, a davar harishus. So for example, somebody is not allowed to eat treif, as a davar aser. Somebody has to keep Shabbos, as a chiyuv. And then there's davar harishus. You can watch a clean movie, for example. It doesn't have any problems. Now, some people say even watching a movie is a shayla b'tul Torah, so it might venture in already into the issue of chiyuv or aser. But nevertheless, there is an understanding that beyond the religious realm, there is a human realm in which you have a freedom to do certain things. You want to go to the park, you can do it. You want to play sports, you can do it. The Alter Rebbe, in accordance with Chabad Chassidic, that's not just the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe and his predecessors and the worldview upon which he bases his worldview is based on the understanding that everything is godliness. Right. What scholars refer to as panentheism. Everything is within God. Ein oid b'lvadai. There is nothing but God, meaning that everything is godly. And the way it is translated, at least within Chabad circles, and at least the way I was taught it, the way I experienced it, is that everything you do must have a godly purpose. If I am playing a game, there is no divine intention. There is nothing that I can say that playing the game has a godly end. I'm doing it in order to relax, that I can serve God, for example. So then, at best, it is called klipas noiga, which means a translucent neutral. It is neutral, but neutral is still a klipa. It's still a shell. It's still a mask over godliness. And that somehow that act has to be transformed and redeemed. And which basically, for me, it set up that me as a human being, I don't really have my humanistic interests don't have any validity. Mm-hmm. The interests that I have, either if they serve God, so then they're part of religion, and if they're not about God, if I just have an aesthetic appreciation for nature, for music, mm-hmm. but it isn't focused, it isn't divinely guided or divinely focused, or doesn't have a divine end, divine teleology, it means a purpose, somehow it can fit into divine purpose, or the end result of it will be helping my avodas Hashem, then that appreciation is invalid. Mm. And that was very, very hard for me to come to terms with it. The kind of essentialism, meaning that you are composed of two essential energies, there's the godly and the animalistic, and that if it isn't godly, then it is beastly, or evil, or invalid from a religious point of view. That was a very, very hard pill for me to swallow. It was hard for me to imagine that all of my life instincts, sexuality, aesthetics, music, art, that all of that was essentially non-kosher unless I was using it, not only beheter, but l'shem shamayim. I think that was a very, very tough thing, and especially the demands of a Beinoni, if taken to the extreme. Well, not even taken to the extreme, taken to the way, literally, right. That even machshava dibur and maisa, even, for example, if somebody controls their sexual thoughts. The initial thought, for example, is beyond their control, but that a person cannot actively engage in sexual fantasizing, that is, according to the Alter Rebbe and Tanya, a Beinoni is somebody that if a if I understand correctly, if a sexual fantasy enters their mind, they need to suppress it. Otherwise, if you indulge a fantasy, like we do, inevitable, then you are violating, then you're no longer abandoning, then you're not. So you always need to be on guard, you always need to fight. And my question is God so draconian or so punitive that he created us that we must fight? It's like the Albert Camus wrote a book, The Myth of Sisyphus, the Sisyphean myth, where it's a Greek myth where somebody, I don't know all the details, I don't remember all the details, but basically the guy's punishment was that he had to climb up with a rock on top of the mountain. And when he reached the top of the mountain, the rock would hurl back to the bottom of the mountain. So his whole life was basically trying to, this endless, useless, bottomless pit of trying to bring the rock back up, and it will never go there.
Right.
So for me, that was an existential awareness that I felt that somehow the Tanya, for all of its beauty,
right.
And I really love the Tanya for many things, and the Alter Rebbe happens to be my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. It isn't that I'm arguing with the Tanya, God forbid, but it is more that I feel existentially, I felt that my human experience of what I felt as a human being was at odds with the blueprint that Tanya was giving. Now, some people will say, well, Dr. Rebbe is describing you, and he's telling you that you need to fight your nefesh habahamis. But for me, I was questioning that is appreciation for art, which is something that I couldn't imagine was something negative or bad.
Right.
It's just something which is human. It's not something which is behemi. Yes, it might be a little bit selfish, but there can also be an altruistic element in art. Art can inspire depravity, yes, to be depraved. It can also inspire altruism. Right. So that was like, I'm just giving you an example of one thing that may have triggered my discontent. There are many others also.
Right. I remember when you're talking, I remember something that really bothered me that I heard when I was younger at Yeshiva. Farbrengen, I think I was like 15, and it's this expression is, I don't know, maybe it's attributed to Ben Shem Tov, maybe, but he says, it's like a very thing you hear often, Bosman, Tarman, Bosman Meg, Dafman.
Mm-hmm.
So what's prohibited is obviously prohibited, but what's permitted is not necessarily that you need to indulge it just because you're allowed to.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember my instinctual reaction at the time was like, wow, okay, it's not enough that everything that I want is already usher, but the few things that I'm left that is okay, you want to take it from me also. And then later on I realized, like, if Chassidus means anything, and if the Chassidic way of life means anything, then I'm not looking to check off the boxes and know that I did everything and now I have some free time so I can get away from it. It's, like you said, that it's all-encompassing, that everything is God. So by extension, I'm not living in this space where I need to do the exact bare minimum or know that I'm doing everything right. And, here I have a little break, a reprieve from this burden, and I get to just be me. It doesn't work that way. It's like, what does Lifnim Shurasa mean? It's not that, I have a whole Shulchan Aruch and now I have a whole second Shulchan Aruch of other things I have to do. It's I shouldn't be living in the zone of just trying to do, I'm living in the service of the Eibishter, so I'm not limited to the exact thing, I'm living beyond it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I have a whole new set of obligations or a whole new set of things that are taken away from me. It means that I'm not living in that technical, transactional space. I don't know if this is true or not. You would be the guy to ask, but I heard that it was an expression by Chassidim that you should be careful to never let the Shulchan Aruch get in the way of your Avodas Hashem. I want it to be true anyway. I don't know.
Well, I heard it actually attributed to several Chassidim, but there is actually a strain in Chassidic thought. For example, if I remember correctly, there's a book of sayings by the Kotzker Rebbe. He himself did not write them down. So they're attributed to him. But the Vart is an emes v'amuna, a sefer containing vertlach, sayings in the Kosker Rebbe, where he says the difference between a chassid and a misnagid is, and I hate that kind of.
Right.
By the way, I don't like it, and it became prevalent that there's a kind of a juvenile triumphalism where a chassid is going to say, "Oh, I'm a chassid and he's a misnagid," by virtue of propping himself up and demolishing the other person. So that isn't what I'm intending to do. But there is a part from the Kosker where he said the difference between a chassid and a misnagid is that a chassid is afraid of God and the misnagid is afraid of the Shulchan Aruch. And there is a strain within certain Hasidic svarim. For example, the Chayz of Lublin talks about, if I'm not mistaken, about the age-old fight or debate between Hasidim and Misnagdim about Zman Tefillah. There's a famous debate about Zman Tefillah where the Hasidim daven late, and the Misnagdim said, well, in Shulchan Aruch it says you need to daven on time. So the Chayz of Lublin talks about the difference between the oivet bi'ava and the oivet bi'yira. Somebody who serves God out of fear is based on the fact that they will make sure that they say Shema in time, make sure that you don't miss Zman Tefillah. Whereas Hasidim are oivet mi'ava, and sometimes the ava is mekalkelis ashura. Sometimes when you're in love, you're able to transgress the letter of the law, or I think more accurately, you're able to forego correct protocol. I think that would be the understanding. There's actually a very geschmacka book by a maskil. It was actually a maskil by the name of Alexander Sederboim. He wrote a book called Keser Kohuna, and he describes the early Pshis Chassidim, and describes their davening late. And he says that their taina, their answer was, what do you think, that God is a bank clerk, that if you come at 4:01, bank closed? That was his answer about Zman Tefillah. And what I find interesting is that usually Chassidim is romanticized as a kind of vision of Judaism and godliness or religion, where even in the most mundane thing that I do, I can find some kind of divine joy. Usually Chassidim are understood that their understanding of godliness is very expansive and very embracing, which I would call an all-inclusive view of Einoid Mulvadoi. That means that everything I do can be celebrated as a divine act. Well, I think the truth is, as some scholars have pointed out, that Martin Buber is responsible for that romanticization. And in fact, that isn't true at all. That most of the Hasidic emphasis was on Bitul Hayesh, self-nullification, transcending the ego. So whereas he took Hasidim and transformed it in a kind of romantic ideal of celebrating the prosaic, the truth of the matter is that Hasidim did focus very much on annihilating the ego, annihilating the self, and it becomes an all-exclusive version of Einoid Mulvadoi, where the all-inclusive version basically says whatever I do can be elevated. No matter what I do, even if I do the most simple thing, the most mundane thing, even when I'm eating, even when I'm having sex, that inherently, without any major transformation, if I'm doing it as a Jew, and if I'm celebrating it, and I'm doing it with holiness and purity, that itself becomes godly. The other view is an opposite view, that unless I have a very clearly regimented lifestyle, which is directing it in Avodas Hashem, so then it isn't kosher. So one is opposite ways of thinking. And before I even was introduced to the scholarship, I just felt that the version of Tanya that I was taught was more of the all-exclusive version. That I must refrain from any kind of self-exploration or self-affirmation. And that becomes very, very harsh. And I also think this is one of the abuses of the system where, for example, Lubavitch will want to talk about W-O-N-T, want to talk about Beetle a lot. And usually it can have very, very disastrous consequences, because if you talk about Bittul to a person who has their self-esteem intact and they feel that they're somebody, then I am somebody, a servant of Hashem, who could be Mavatal myself. But if the point of Bittul is that I'm sorry for my French, you're a piece of shit, and you're worth nothing, you're a piece of drek, because Bittul, who are you? You're Einoid Mulvada, you're nothing. So that can really give you a severe blow. That can be a severe blow to your ego and self-esteem, where you feel that your mom is a piece of jet. Who are you? Who are you? You're garnished. You're bottled. You're such a direct. So I feel that can be abuse, and I grew up that way. In other words, I felt I had a hard time differentiating between the higher ideal of bittul, which in order to be bittul, you can't be a shmata. Shmata is not bittul. Being a shmata is not being an askupa nedresses, being a doormat, being a threshold. That isn't bittul. Bittul is you take somebody who has intellect, who has emotions, and they take all their energies and in the service of God. That is real bittul. If somebody has something to offer and he sacrifices for God, that is bittul. But if somebody has nothing to offer, if he's a shtik drek, there's no chiddush that he's batul. He's batul because he's worthless. And I think there are a lot of concepts that are used that are propagated within Hasidus, where the mashpiyim, they don't necessarily mean harm, but they don't know how it can be interpreted. Maybe in an extreme way by certain people. I don't know if my experience is identical to other people. I don't even know if many of my colleagues even thought into the meaning of all this. In other words, I don't know whether my colleagues even had the kind of existential exploration that I did in terms of that. Yeah.
Yeah. No, this is all ringing, very, very, it's hitting home. I wonder I would imagine that these concepts that today you're able to read them or think about them and have a different conception based on, your maturity, and you're not a victim to your upbringing or whatever the emotional stuff that you were hearing those concepts with at that time. And if that's the case, which I know for me it is, and every time I kind of go back to a concept that in the past I registered as degrading or abusive, I realized that really either didn't say that altogether, or it was a completely like I don't know, left field interpretation, that there was really no, and I came to like a very practical conclusion that for a lot of things, even if we were able to assume that an average 13 or 15-year-old coming to yeshiva was coming from the healthiest of family, non-trauma, mental illness, non-pathological, right? Let's just assume the best, which is crazy considering coming from a large family and socioeconomic conditions and second, third generation Holocaust trauma, not to mention a zillion other things, and just religious trauma. But putting all that aside, I don't think even the healthiest of 13 or 16-year-olds are in a position to be learning concepts that really require subtlety that an adolescent mind is not ready for. I know it seems like just a very pashut thing, but I think that would explain a lot. I mean, some of the interpretation of bittul into I'm a piece of shit it could be contributed to the people that taught it, and where were they at in terms of their conception of their own self, and how they just, projected that onto whoever they were teaching. And some of that I'm already walking around with a piece of shit, as I'm a piece of shit. So anything I learn that can possibly affirm that, I'm going to gravitate to, right? But then there's just every 16-year-old is dealing with, coming to terms with their identity, and usually, around that time, it's not the best, and it takes, people in their, at this point, maybe it was earlier in previous times, but now it's people in their mid-20s where they start kind of coming to terms with that, and maybe then they're in a position to appreciate concepts that really require a lot of nuance to appreciate. And I wonder if we're doing, not we, but people are doing a disservice by teaching such stuff to minds that are not ready for it. And if that would, like, I'll give you an example, like we're talking about the bittul thing. So I recently started learning Shar Yichud V'Amunah. I would say for the I don't know what time, but the truth is I never really learned it, because whenever I learned it, practically speaking, I was telling a friend, if I ever started Tanya, let's say after you discuss it, this is going to be the year I'm going to learn Tanya. I'd start doing it every morning, and I'll learn the 2-3 lines, and somehow whatever it says, somehow all it's saying is stop masturbating, you piece of garbage. And how am I going to continue reading something that's telling me I'm a piece of shit, So eventually I'll stop, and then I'll go masturbate, because that's what you do when you read stop masturbating. And that was it, right? So I'm saying, like, in jest, but kind of also serious, that I was learning it for the first time. And the way the Alter Rebbe lays it out, the mashal of the ray of the sun, which is really nothing on its own. It's completely nullified within the sun itself, because that's all it really is. No part of me reacted to that as I'm nothing, in the sense of I'm a piece of garbage, I'm worthless. It was only, I'm nothing? Well, what does nothing mean? It means my entire being is from the source. So it wasn't nothing in the sense of I'm worthless. It was like I'm so much more than what I thought. Because I thought I'm reliant on my, whatever I can muster up from within this self that's suffering. Like, no. I'm attached to my source. And this nothing can accomplish anything, considering that I'm nothing more than a ray of my source, which is everything. I'm not living in conflict too. I'm in relation to my source. And therefore, I'm not getting in my own way, and I can accomplish and be a whole lot more. And when I don't have to take responsibility for it, because it's not me, I don't have to get into the whole neurotic self, sabotaging, because I don't have to fight for it, because it's not really me. It was the most relieving and redeeming kind of concept, liberating, yeah. And I was like, wow, what a shud, what a waste that I, sat for years experiencing or conceptualizing this as anything but that, and so I wonder if a big amount of it is just practically, people don't feel the freedom to kind of customize, the way things are taught, certainly, but even when things are taught, take into account who they're teaching it to and all that kind of stuff, on a practical level.
I think you raise a very, very important point, and I agree with you. I appreciate your example of understanding bittul and the bittul, the mashal and Tanya of the ziv hashemesh v'shemesh, rays of the sun, in the sun, how the rays of the sun is not something distinct from the sun, but something which is part and parcel, just an expression of the sun. And that also raises the issue of the nexus, or the continuation or combination between philosophical concepts and the psychological self-perception of people. For example, I don't know that somebody else who would have encountered the same text would have taken the notion of bittul the way I did. It could be that at that point I was struggling with self-esteem issues, or I was, struggling with self-esteem issues. So I took the Tanya and I interpreted it my way as a way of trying to undermine my own desperate attempt to find my own self-worth. So sometimes it isn't the text that is to blame or the message, but the way the message is packaged, the way it is being taught. I definitely do feel that one of the problems in the Lubavitch Chinuch system today is the fact that they don't tailor the message in an age-appropriate manner, as you mentioned. I mean, just for instance, I remember I lived through the heady years of Tafshin Gimel, Tafshin Dalet, 1993, 1994, when the whole Meshichism, Messianism around the Rebbe reached a very high fever pitch. And I remember that my mashpiyim were bringing very, very strongly about Yechi Adonenu concepts, or singing Yechi, talking about what it means the Rebbe is Mashiach, talking about the imminent arrival of Mashiach and all that. And I was looking, and I was thinking to myself, remember, at the Farbrengen, I was probably about 13, 14, 15 years old at that time, given those years, maybe a little bit before, a little after. And I was saying, wait 1 second. My mashpia is talking about lofty concepts, or at best lofty, at worst bizarre, or crazy ideas of the Rebbe being Mashiach. Other people will say crazy, but even a truly believing Lubavitcher, they're lofty concepts. It's not something that it's not something that I necessarily can feel or understand with my puny intelligence of what it means for someone to be Mashiach, what the revelation of Mashiach is all about. And I said, wait 1 second, why doesn't my mashpia talk about what is known in Chassidic parlance as chatas nurim, which is masturbation? Why doesn't he talk about the very real struggles that the boys are going through? And I think that caused an implosion within Lubavitch. On the one hand, you have those that are talking very, very high and mighty. They're talking about iskashus to the Rebbe. And what?
Macro stuff.
Yeah. And I do feel that maybe for a certain population, that is helpful. For a certain population, if you speak high and mighty, you talk about iskashus, you talk about mystical concepts, so then people are gonna do the right thing because they believe that they're connecting to a very high level. But for many people, and I see this especially in the younger generation,
or they get a reprieve from having to think about that, kind of get lost in the big stuff. I'm sorry.
No. I feel that you're raising a very, very important point, that maybe our focus today should be, and the truth of the matter is, talking about Tanya, I don't want to be hypercritical. Like I said, the Alter Rebbe happens to be my great-great-great-great-grandfather, and I feel that I have part of the neshama of the Alter Rebbe in me. But yet, I do wonder whether that maybe teaching Tanya to a 13-year-old, 12-year-old, and going into all the categories of Tanya and what it actually demands of you is perhaps to kind of paradoxically or ironically invoke the first parak of Tanya, L'shavik mar chaya l'chol beria. You're not giving anybody any breathing space. You're not allowing anybody to live. If you're setting up such a high standard, and we say that Reb Hillel Paritcher said halavai beinani. Reb Hillel Paritcher was known to anybody else who would be a tzaddik. He said halavai should be on the level of a beinani. So maybe it does damage. Maybe when we set up the bar so high, instead of inspiring people, because usually, I've studied to become an English teacher, and there's an hypothesis. I forgot who's the author of it. It's like when you're teaching English or any foreign language, you have to make sure that it isn't so easy that what you're teaching them is completely non-challenging. On the other hand, it can't be so challenging that they won't be able to assimilate the information. It has to be, for the most part, what they're comfortable with, but a little bit more. Like 95% or 90% of the words they should know, and then you teach them an extra few words that they can assimilate. So on each level, you got to know where are they holding, where are they at. So for certain Bachurim, you can tell them more. For other Bachurim, you need to tell them about basic Yiddishkeit. There are certain Bachurim I think it's much more important today to tell Bachurim what it means to keep Shabbos and explain to them the beauty of Shabbos. Or maybe how to deal with their sexual struggles, how to deal with their parents, how to deal with what it means to be a Hasidic Jew in a world where people are being modern and want to be free and want to be secular and want to explore all their options, and there's a free marketplace of ideas and forms of expression. I think today we need to go back to the basics. And what's interesting is that Lubavitch, in terms of their outreach, understand that very well. That whereas, let's say, that Alter Rebbe spoke to very, very high Hasidic discourses, when it came to the time of the Rebbe Rashav and the Frierdiker Rebbe, when they're fighting for survival of Judaism in Russia, where do they go? It was basics about building mikvahs, about Shabbos, and about kosher. And also, when it comes to Chabad houses, we understand that message very, very well. But yet, when it comes to our own, when it comes to InReach, then we're telling Bachurim high madregas about all these lofty roles, and maybe they're out of touch in the fact that who's going to guarantee that your child has a basic appreciation for Judaism, who cares to wake up and daven, or keep Shabbos, or keep kashrus. You're taking that for granted, and they're interested in the next level, which is understanding of Einoi Mulvade.
Yeah.
By the way, I do want to respond to that statement. First of all, I've always marveled at the Rebbe's genius in his ability to spread Yiddishkeit, and his concept of breaking it down to the Mivtzoyim, which are 10 mitzvah campaigns, which is basically a very tangible, incremental, gradual approach to Yiddishkeit. Now, those are not intended for your average frum Jew. The Rebbe's understanding is, it's not like you need to do all 613. Not that you can get away with 10. But yet, I do appreciate what you're saying, that, and I don't think the Rebbe ever intended as if you're only keeping 10 things, keep these 10. I don't even think it was that issue. It wasn't as if the Rebbe is saying, if you want to reduce Yiddishkeit to the 10 commandments or 10 most important things, these are the 10 most important things. I think these were certain campaigns that, for all kinds of different reasons, let's say Tefillin was initially conceived leading up to the Six-Day War as a school for protection, partially, also for the mitzvah, obviously. But all of them came about in different circumstances. So to say that the Rebbe came up with a 10-point plan and reducing Judaism to the basic as a 10-point system, I don't think that is true. However, I do appreciate what you're saying, and I will agree with you that the Rebbe was a genius in understanding that if you're going to tell somebody, you need to keep all of Torah mitzvahs at once, or we're going to teach you. There are other kiruv approaches of work based on teaching Torah. And we can talk about the relative merits of that approach as well. I think there's a lot to it. I think that Lubavitch can also learn from maybe perhaps the greater Jewish teaching and involvement in Jewish teaching Torah among other kiruv groups. Lubavitch's strong suit is not, unfortunately, teaching Torah on a high level. Not on a basic level, perhaps, but teaching Torah on a very high level. I have heard from people who have become Bali Tshuva through Lubavitch that say after a while we've hungered for learning Torah on a higher level, and the shluchim are not able to provide that. But that is putting that aside. On a basic level, we do teach people, but I do think that the Rebbe is basically saying, and he actually invoked the Rambam, that you cannot underestimate the value of one deed. That even if you're Jewish by one deed only, or even by a few things, that has infinite value. And it doesn't give you an excuse not to do all the rest, but what it does show is that look at the positive, count your blessings. That here are important things, and like that the Gemara says that afilu Poshi Yisrael is v'lei mitzvahs karim, and that even the transgressors of Israel are full of mitzvahs, of good deeds like a pomegranate. And the truth of the matter is that if you look at Jews today, especially frum Jews, especially people that grew up in a frum environment, even if they're a little lax, bottom line is they're doing so much compared to Jews that are completely unaffiliated, unfortunately. But people that are, let's say, maybe a little more frum, a little less frum, a little more lax, a little more particular, if we think about it in context, comparing that to an unaffiliated Jew who doesn't know about their Judaism, perhaps doesn't even go to shul, or doesn't go to shul on Yom Kippur, is intermarried and doesn't eat kosher at all, or is maybe very, very marginally culturally Jewish. A Jew who is observant, even if they don't keep everything, and again, I'm not saying that halachically there's an excuse for it, but they're doing a lot, and there's a lot that goes in their direction. I think there's positive thinking that the Rebbe did encourage a lot. That I am a ben yachid of God, using that Chassidic language. So I don't think the Rebbe, and I always tell people, it's very interesting about the Rebbe, because on the one hand, the Rebbe was very strong-minded when it came to Yiddishkeit. He did not believe in a compromised Judaism at all. He was always in the Karvon Torah. You could bring Judaism closer to Jews and not bring the Jews... the opposite of the Freudian slip. You need to bring Jews closer to Judaism, not the other way around. But the Rebbe was very clear that you couldn't compromise, and the Rebbe paid a price for it. In other words, the Rebbe was not ready to cross certain lines, which arguably would have gained him more adherence. Had he made, for example, like Shlomo Carlebach did, erased a little bit the gender line. Again, there's a problem with Shlomo Carlebach as well.
But Shlomo Carlebach has a beautiful story with your grandfather, by dollars, I think it was.
Yeah, which one? Groner?
He wrote to the Rebbe asking the Rebbe if he should partake in this kind of other Jewish organizations in Melbourne were kind of wanted to do a joint concert with Shlomo Carlebach, and he asked the Rebbe if he can, sign on to it. And the Rebbe suggested that he not do that. I assume because of that reason, because Shlomo Carlebach was more of the approach of bringing Torah down to the people, not the other way around. And then later on, I think it's on a video of dollars, or not, but the Rebbe asks your grandfather, did you see Shlomo Carlebach when he came to town? And the Rebbe says, no, the Rebbe Gehasen, The Rebbe says, a chaver comes to your shtut and you didn't have him over for tea? Meaning one's got nothing to do with the other, right? There's and there, you see how the Rebbe on a one-to-one basis, so a Reform rabbi comes and the Rebbe tries to slowly introduce, maybe do a little bit of this. He doesn't tell him you have to do everything. So there's a standard on the macro, but then on an individual basis, there's a humanity there, and there isn't this cup and vant mentality, which is a nuance that I think people don't always appreciate. And I think when we're talking between, as human beings here ourselves, that needs to be taken into account. This is like this thing is like, you grew up from, now you are part of this macro approach, which is the whole deal. Which is, no. That may be a standard on what is our value system is not one in which we compromise. But on an individual level, everyone is an individual and deserves to have their own relationship and not try to bite off more than they can chew, and not everyone is capable. And I don't know if that nuance is appreciated.
First of all, just for the record, I have heard the story with my grandfather and Shlomo Carlebach. Without going into all the details, what I could say is that there was definitely, as far as I recall, a hira from the Rebbe, an instruction directed from the Rebbe that he should not be invited in the name of Lubavitch to Melbourne. In other words, that Lubavitch should not grant validity or legitimize his activities because the Rebbe took issue with his approach. However, on a personal level, that my grandfather should visit him, should be mekarev him. Mm-hmm. And I think you're correct, that the difference between the macro or the micro, or between the personal and the ideal, the philosophy, the matter of principle. I think that in general is a very important balance that we need to have in terms of chinuch. That while we might preach a certain ideal philosophically, that doesn't mean that we are punitive towards the individual who does not meet those standards. And I think the truth of the matter is, Lubavitch, Luba, love, for the most part, are successful in imparting that feeling. I think that even those of us who grew up and felt that maybe there was a bit judgmentalism and there was a bit of that lacking, I think overall we felt, and I feel, that the Rebbe, bottom line, the Rebbe was an Oyev Yisrael. Mm-hmm. The bottom line, the Rebbe was a person of chesed. The Rebbe was a Hillel, it wasn't a Shammai. The Rebbe, unlike other communities, which is Shaiget Sarois, that if you're not living up to the standards, then out of here. Mm-hmm. So, and I think that is very, very crucial in the success of Lubavitch, and also as a redeeming factor. And let me just expand it a little bit more, where I think that it can be very, very useful both for educators and also for people struggling. I remember that I was at a point where I dealt with my intellectual questions, where I said, in the spirit of the Kotzker, who had this radical quest for truth, and I happen to like the Kotzker's approach very much because it talks to me on that kind of radical quest for truth. And maybe we can talk about it at a different time, why I find the Kotzker Rebbe and his approach so challenging, and it isn't cool, it isn't enjoyable, but it's one which basically cuts you to size and makes you really think about yourself in a very profound way without giving you any kind of room for self-delusion. But I once felt in the spirit of the Kosker Rebbe that either Yiddishkeit is 100%, or the way I put it, I'll rephrase it, that if Judaism is 99% true, it's 100% false. Meaning that even if it's 99% true, just missing the 100%, then it's 100% false. There are many people that suffer from a certain absolute black and white type of thinking, where if I'm not able to keep all of Yiddishkeit, then I might as well not keep anything. If I can't be completely fromm, so then I might as well be frei. And I think in my own struggle to remain connected to my upbringing, by the way, I have this motto of mine that we're endowed with both wings and roots. And we need to make sure that we don't sever our roots nor clip our wings. There's a kind of that dichotomy or that paradox between, on the one hand, remaining true to our roots, and if we envision our roots as very much like a tree. A tree is not a bird. It doesn't fly freely. You cannot just spread your wings and take off wherever you want. You need to be rooted. So growing up in a tradition like Yiddishkeit is very much being rooted, or I give another muscle, like a train track. In order for a train to go the proper way, it has to be connected to the track. If you derail it, it's completely off, then it won't function anymore. And then there is that aspect and that paradox of growing up within a rooted system like a tree, that if you sever yourself off it, you're disconnected, you die. And yet there's also, that is one part of me which I feel deeply rooted, and there's another part of me that I feel like I'm a free thinker, I'm a creative spirit like a bird, and I want to spread my wings and fly freely without being connected, with no strings attached to any specific culture or tradition or religion which is confining me in any kind of way. And how do I maintain that balance between, on the one hand, not being severed from my roots, and on the other hand, not clipping my wings? That is a paradox. So, but I'm using that as a way of where I am reconsidering and trying to figure out for the last 20 years, maybe give or take a little bit, my own connection to Yiddishkeit and to Lubavitch and to Chassidus and all that. One of the guiding principles that was very important for me is that there is complexity, there is nuance, there is color. Some people say there are shades of gray. I say no, there are shades of color. It's not just an issue of black and white. The beauty is, some people feel that Yiddishkeit can only be true if I look at it as black and white. So look at it as shades of color, not shades of gray, color. Gray means that there's iffy, shady. No, there's a beauty, there's a mosaic of color. And in my own lifestyle, in general, I have a much more complex and nuanced approach to Yiddishkeit in terms of my intellectual understanding of what Judaism is all about, understanding different streams within Judaism, understanding that what I was taught, the narrative that I was taught is one out of many, that Chabad does not have a monopoly on truth. The way I was taught, or the derech that I was taught, does not have a monopoly on truth. For me, I think people today, and this is where I also underwent a shift of not focusing so much, or the shift from absolute questions of truth to more questions of connection, identity, and meaning. Because if I were to ask the question, is Judaism true? I can have a lot of questions. I can poke holes in a lot of things. If the question is truth. If the question is more, is Judaism meaningful to me? Do I feel connected to it? Do I identify as a Jew? And do I want to identify as a religious Jew? What does it mean for me to identify as a religious Jew? There can be much broader meanings than those that are doctrinally prescribed by the powers that be, by the authorities. But that is already like phase two. For me, I went on my own I went also on an intellectual journey where my understanding of Yiddishkeit is very, very different than what I was taught in Yeshiva. And I'm trying to reconcile my intellectual understanding with Yiddishkeit, with everything that I grew up with. And I felt that the system as it stands, especially in the more Haredi, the more ultra-Orthodox hashkafas, simply don't have space for a more expansive intellectual view that I've arrived at. They simply cannot agree with it. They cannot tolerate it. It would be a head-on collision, and I live with it. I live with it every day. I know that the kind of understanding of Judaism that I have come to through decades of exploration is completely at odds with what a yeshiva boy is taught in cheder, or what you're taught in Beis Medrash. And there was many years that I went in terrible, torturous questioning of trying to reconcile what I was taught in yeshiva with what I learned from other books and other sources of information. And no one was really successful in providing magical answers, and as far as I know, they don't exist. At one point, I was writing to a professor, and like, the frum people are definitely not helping me as much as they are mashpiyim and they're inspirational people. But I felt that the more Hasidic you are, the more ignorant you are about the more challenging scholarly questions that can undermine your faith. And I remember I was once writing to a professor who actually, his article caused me to question a lot. And I met with him, and then we spent like 5 hours talking about all this stuff. And he tried to be helpful, but really the scholarly facts were very unsettling for me. But I remember he asked me, so where are you holding with your Judaism? And I said, I came to realize that there's a shift that I need to go through. And that shift is that I underwent a paradigm shift, that I'm no longer looking for answers to my questions. I'm looking for a response to a challenge. If I put it in the intellectual realm of answering my questions, so if you don't answer your questions, so maybe you say, okay, there is no answer, let me leave it. If I look at the questions more as an existential challenge to my whole person, my whole identity as a Jew, as a religious Jew, and the intellectual question is one element chipping away at the integrity of my religious identity as a Jew. So if I don't find an answer to that question, so I might not find an intellectually satisfying answer to the question, but is there an existential response within myself that I can muster up and say, okay, im kol zeh ani mamin. Whether it means ani mamin, that I believe, or sometimes ani mamin means ani ne'eman. I am still loyal. I still live as a loyal Jew, even if that particular concept I have difficulty with.
Yeah.
But that is a different discussion. It's a whole different discussion about intellectual challenges of faith, which I think that here I feel is that something which is more of a specialized knowledge. I don't think that most people, unlike, for example, struggles with emotional expression, artistic expression, sexual expression, and all those kind of issues, which are standard fare for every bacher, every girl going through the system, more specialized intellectual questions don't necessarily bother every person. It's more the field of somebody who's more curious and more precocious and happens to come across challenging questions, and that becomes a whole different ballgame. But they do exist, and educators need to know that. That means that there's a limit to how much their attempt of in other words, there's one level of what we spoke before of making Judaism emotionally comfortable or emotionally welcoming to people. On that level, you can tell Machancha, maybe you should teach Tanya a little bit differently. And that doesn't undermine the system. All it talks about is different window dressing, a better bedside manner, better packaging. It doesn't fundamentally challenge the hashkafa of the system. The intellectual challenges do fundamentally undermine the hashkafa of the system, and that at a certain point, the system has to say, well, listen, this is our hashkafa. We cannot entertain your questions. Sorry for this very long-winded...
I just want to pick out two things. Yeah. One, it sounds like what you're describing in terms of like what you were dealing with for a while as seeking answers to certain questions. I wonder if we have a tendency to experience questions and doubt as if we're looking for objective responses, when in reality we're dealing with subjective experience that is both emotional and intellectual, and then we hear all the answers and somehow it still doesn't work, and then we come to an appreciation that all I really want to know is that whether it makes sense or not, I'm at home here despite all that, like you were saying. So we come to terms that really we're looking for subjective answers to a subjective question. And maybe that's okay. Like maybe that isn't intellectually dishonest to acknowledge that we are subjective by nature. We experience what we think as to be completely objective. Everything is subjective. There's no way, much as I want to think, no one is really can surpass that because it's just, that's our nature. Mm. And yet when I'm thinking that I could kind of step out of that and somehow I'm going to hear something or read something that's finally going to make sense, if I to some degree I would imagine I would be scared of someone like that.
Who what?
Who can get an answer, a technical answer to a question that isn't really technical and be satiated with that. Mm-hmm. It's like there's some lifeless there. Like there's an element of Picasso once said, computers are so useless, all they can do is provide answers. Right? So it's like, really, like that's what it means to be alive, that you can be satisfied with a technical, objective response to it. Like, they're supposed to be subjective and emotional, not just, yeah.
That was one thing. There was another thing as well that you wanted to...
Yeah, so the other, I wanted to circle back just because it's a beautiful story that I keep getting wrong. We're talking about the Rebbe, and ultimately he was an Aliya of Yisrael, and that came through in so much. And at the same time, he towed that line. But you mentioned, Yisrael, that Malay Mitzvahs Kirima, and
Philippish Yisrael, Malay Mitzvahs Kirima.
Philippish Yisrael, the Gemara. So there was a story about a Yechidus with a Satmar Chassid. You know that story? Or it was actually in a Sikha, I think.
Dollars, where he told him about the Yismach Moshe, why am I Mekar of Yidden?
Maybe that.
Go ahead.
I heard that it was Yechidus, the Rebbe had, was Tutzach in Satmar. This guy who was coming for a bracha, and then the way I heard it was the Satmar Chassid was chazering a Torah from the Satmar Rebbe, who was saying, how is it the Gemara that says that Philippish Yisrael, and meaning he phrased the question and is like, how is it possible that the Gemara says
Anapeshe Yisrael, how is it possible? I heard B'Shem Satmar Rav, one of their Rabbanim.
Yeah.
How is it possible that the Gemara says Anapeshe Yisrael they is full of Mitzvahs Karimah? And the Rebbe says, my question is, how is it possible that someone who's Bali Mitzvahs Karimah and the Gemara calls him a B'Shem Yisrael?
Right.
Difference of perspective. Yeah. So there is that beautiful story that actually Velvel Pasternak told in your session with them, or that gathering or the Chevra, where he actually writes it in his book that
about Vladimir Chayfetz.
About Vladimir Chayfetz, right. The story goes that he was a brilliant arranger of music. He was Russian, and he was a secular Jew, but I guess with a feel for Jewish music, and he was a brilliant arranger. He worked on Ichoyach and other records as well. And when he started becoming acquainted with music, he wanted to hear it firsthand. He said, "You're just giving me sheet music, I want to hear it live." And Simchas Torah was coming up, so Velvel Pasternak gave him some names of shuls to go to. One was on Bedford Avenue, if I'm not mistaken, the Satmar Beis Medrash. The other one was 770 Eastern Parkway, 770 Lubavitcher Shul. Anyway, so basically the way it goes in the story is he goes into Satmar, and when they start singing, he takes out his sheet music, a special staff, 5 lines and a staff, and music that every musicologist goes around with to record, do field work. He starts writing. So somebody comes up to him and swiftly ushers him out of the shul, saying that we don't write. We're not allowed to write, and therefore basically get out of here or whatever. And he comes to Lubavitch. He also takes out his notepad and he starts writing. Somebody comes up to him and they say, Shalom Aleichem, who are you? What are you doing here? Whatever. Welcome to 770, Good Yom Tov. We're happy that you came, that you Yid comes to our office. By the way, you should know that we don't write on Yom Tov. So that was a way of saying that both Satmar and Lubavitch kept the same Torah. It's not as if Lubavitch said that you could write on Yom Tov and they were compromising on their view of Yiddishkeit, but they were a lot more open and accepting, appreciating the value of the Yid and where he was holding that the right approach is one of Hillel and not one Shammai. But continue. That is, yeah. This is just in line of what you're mentioning, the story, the difference between Peshay Yisrael versus being Moli Mitzvahs Karim. Go ahead.
Yeah, when I heard that story, so what struck me, whether it's true or not, is when the Rebbe heard that, he was crying, and it's something that a sentiment you see and hear from the Rebbe a lot, that just hearing that kind of notion, that is the direction that someone, a Rebbe or someone, a leader, would conceptualize the question that way, pained the Rebbe so deeply, to denigrate a Jew in that way, And that to me is the stuff that kind of keeps me, emotionally too attached. You talked about roots, Anyway, but I don't know how much time. I want to ask you two things before I forget. One, you mentioned that you done a lot of study and academic work about Chaim Grada. What is it about him specifically that you're drawn to? If you could talk a little bit about Yiddish literature and then Chaim Grada specifically, and kind of
You want me to talk about that first and then go back to the other points, or talk about the other points first?
All right, let's put that aside so we know that we could put
Well, I'll talk about it.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
I'll talk about what? The Chaim Grada first, or first?
Let me ask you one other question before we get there, because otherwise we're not have time.
Yeah.
But you mentioned sexual angst and confusion being a strong element that contributes to, frustration and confusion and searching.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone I know, somewhat well, that's clearly the case, especially people who grow up in our community.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just a human thing and a male thing. And a friend of mine recently graduated from with a master's degree, and she was telling me that one of the first things that her professor told her, if you're working with men and you're not talking about sex, you're not really doing therapy. It's not possible. So that's just true for men. And then young men, growing men, and then growing up in a culture that is, at best secretive, at worst, shaming, and to me, secrecy to me is so damaging. So, like I said, men I know well in general, but particularly from the community, whether single or married, so much of the, confusion and frustration is rooted around sexuality, and just the general walking around with a sense of wrong can often be traced back to feeling in a totality of wrong. My whole being is wrong because here is this one thing, this one unspoken thing that is so central, but yet never quite presented that way, but I assume it is. It's so much so that we can't even talk about it. And and I'm engaged in that to a degree that is wrong, and hence my entire being is wrong and questionable. And I've been made aware enough that I could almost see it on people's faces. And it pains me, and part of that is just it's part of life, and it's supposed to be, and it's not supposed to be resolved, and I don't have any fantasy that outside in the world it's non-existent, but I definitely believe that where there is honest discussion and to kind of strip the secrecy and the shame, that men could just live life at least with a sense of not like crushed and burdened by some secret that they're living with. Anyway, I would love to hear your thoughts on that. I mean, I gave more an opinion, but what your observations have been, because you may mention it too in a few ways, and do you see any kind of remedy for that in terms of the religious environment? What could be done differently?
Gereis bist du, Schino, Akidaisha, wie weit bist du? Wenn der Kulisse Wald kleiner geworden, Wald ist Schino neiter geworden. Gules, oi Gules, wie groß bist du? Schino, Akidaisha, wie weit bist du? Wenn der Kulisse Wald kleiner geworden, Wald ist Chino neunter geworden. Sorry, you're running away.